job. At least the woman had not gotten her claws on Moiraine. With her mind, she would have been a wonder as Satalia's assistant. Hungry or not, she went in search of Moiraine rather than dinner to let her know she would be searching by herself. The sight of Moiraine always made her smile. Satalia had been wrong in one particular. She was not a pretty little porcelain doll. She was a beautiful little porcelain doll. On the outside, anyway. Inside, where it counted, was another matter. The first time Swan saw her, she had been sure the Kyrianan girl would crack like a spindle shell in a matter of days. But Moiraine had turned out to be as tough as she herself, if not tougher. No matter how often she was knocked down, she climbed back to her feet straight away. Moiraine did not know the meaning of give up, which was why it was a surprise to find her slumped in a chair in her sitting room, her shawl slung over the chair back with a sulky expression on her face. A green glazed teapot on a tray gave off the smell of hot tea, but the white cups looked unused. "What happened to you?" Swan asked. "You haven't earned a penance already, have you?" "Worse," Moiraine replied disconsolately. Her voice usually minded Swan of silver bells, but Moiraine hated hearing that. "Tamra has put me in charge of distributing the bounty." "Blood and bloody ashes." Swan tested the words on her tongue. There would be no switchings now for speaking like herself. She had heard Aes Sedai who could have made any dockman blush. She did seem to sense a faint taste of soap, though. Does she suspect? Is she trying to make sure you can't interfere? Maybe that was why Satalia had latched hold of her. No, she had done well on the bloody woman's tests. The more fool her. "I think not, Swan. I was taught to manage an estate, though I only did it for a few months before coming to the tower. She said that gave me all the skills I needed." Her mouth twisted wryly. "I was lying around loose, as she put it, and I suspect she decided to give an onerous task to a blue as a way of being fair. What about you? What sort of puzzles did Satalia want you to look at?" "A lot of old reports," Swan grumbled, easing down onto a cushioned chair. If only her skin did not feel 3 sizes too small. Without asking, she poured herself a cup of tea. They never asked about things like that. She wanted me to puzzle out what happened 40 or 50 years ago in Tarabon and Saldeia and Altara. As soon as the words were out of her, she wanted to clap a hand over her mouth, but it was too late for that. Moiraine sat up straight, suddenly very interested. "Satalia heads the Blue Aja Eyes and Ears." It was not a question. Trust her to see to the heart right away. "Don't even whisper that. The bloody woman will boil me down like an oil fish if she learns I let it slip. She'll probably have it anyway, but I don't want to give her cause before she finds it." She certainly would, if today had been any guide. "Look now, handing out the bounty can't last more than a few months. After, you're free to go. Let me know where you're going, and if I learn anything, I'll try to get word to you." The Blue had an extensive network of eyes and ears, as useful for passing messages out as for sending reports in. "I do not know that I can afford a few months," Moiraine said in a small voice, dropping her eyes, very unlike herself. I have been keeping a secret from you, Swan, but they never kept secrets from each other. I am very afraid the Hall means to put me on the Sun Throne." Swan blinked. "Moiraine? A queen? You'd make a wonderful queen. And don't bring up those Aes Sedai queens who came to bad ends. That was a very long time ago. There's hardly a ruler anywhere who doesn't have an Aes Sedai advisor. Who's ever said a word against them except the White Cloaks?" "It is a long step from advisor to queen, Swan." Moiraine sat up, carefully arranging her skirts, and her voice took on that infuriatingly patient tone she used, explaining things. "Obviously, the Hall thinks I could take the throne without bringing mobs into the streets, but I do not want to take the chance they are wrong. Kyrian has endured enough these last 2 years without that. And even if they are right, no one has ruled Kyrian for long without being willing to stoop to kidnapping, assassination, and worse. My great-grandmother, Carowyn, ruled more than 50 years. and the Tower calls her a very successful ruler because Kyrian prospered and had few wars under her, but her name is still used to frighten children. Better to be forgotten than remembered like Carowyn Domodred, but even with the Tower behind me, I will have to try matching her if the Hall succeeds. Suddenly her shoulders slumped, and her face broke close to tears. What can I do, Swan? I am caught like a fox in a trap, and I cannot even chew off my own foot to escape. Setting her teacup on the tray, Swan knelt beside Moraine's chair and put her hands on the other woman's shoulders. "We'll find a way out," she said, putting far more confidence into her voice than she felt. "We'll find a way." She was a little surprised the first oath allowed her to say those words. She could imagine no way out for either of them. "If you say so, Swan." Moiraine did not sound as if she believed either. "There is one thing I can remedy. May I offer you healing?" Swan could have kissed her. In fact, she did.
There was still considerable snow close to the mountains that rose up ahead of Lan, and the trampled tracks of a large body of men lay clear beneath the afternoon sun, leading straight across the hills toward the cloud-capped heights that reared higher and higher the deeper you looked. He raised his looking glass, but he could discern no movement ahead. The Aiel must already be into the mountains. Cat Dancer stamped a hoof impatiently. "Are those the spine of the world?" Rakim called in that rasping voice. "Impressive, but somehow I thought they'd be taller." "That Skinslayer's dagger," a well-traveled Arafellan laughed. "Call them the foothills to the spine and you won't be far wrong." "Why are we just standing here?" Ganniadra demanded, low-voiced enough not to be called down for it, but loud enough for Lan to hear. Ganniadra liked to press the edges where he could. Bukama relieved him of the necessity to answer. "Only fools try fighting Aiel in mountains," he said loudly. Twisting toward Lan in his saddle, he lowered his own voice to a near whisper, and the creases of his permanent scowl deepened. "The light sand Pedron Nile doesn't choose now to paint his face." Nile, Lord Captain Commander of the Children of the Light, had the command today. "He won't," Lan said simply. Only a handful knew war as well as Nile, which meant that this particular war might very well end this day. He wondered whether it would be called a victory. Sliding the looking glass back into its saddle case, he found himself looking north, feeling the pull, an iron filing feeling the lodestone. It was almost pain after so long. Some wars could not be won, yet they still must be fought. Studying his face, Bukama shook his head. "And only a fool jumps from one war straight into another." He did not bother to speak softly, and several Damani in Lan's sight gave him odd looks, clearly wondering what Bukama was talking about. No Borderlander needed to wonder. They knew who he was. "A month or two will rest me, Bukama." That was how long it would take to ride home. A month with luck. "A year, Lan. Just 1 year. Oh, all right, 8 months." Bukama made that sound a great concession. Perhaps he felt tired. He'd always seemed made of iron, but he was no longer young. 4 months, Lan conceded. He had borne waiting 2 years. He could bear another 4 months. And if Bukama still felt weary then, that was a chasm he would have to cross when he came to it. As it happened, Nile had not chosen to become a fool, which was very well indeed, given that above half the army had already departed in the belief the victory had been won days ago, if not when the Aiel first began their retreat. And they were calling it a great victory. At least those who had not fought were, the hangers-on and bystanders, and the historians already writing as if they knew everything. Lan was willing to let them. His mind was already 200 leagues to the north. Saying their goodbyes, he and Bukama turned their faces southward toward softer lands, avoiding Tar Valon altogether. It was a great and wondrous city by all accounts, but too full of Aes Sedai for any comfort. Bukama talked animatedly of what they might see in Andor and perhaps Tyr. They had been in both lands, but contending with Aiel, they had not seen even the fabled Stone of Tyr, or any of the great cities. Lan did not speak at all unless Bukama addressed him. He felt the pull of home sharply. All he wanted was a return to the Blight, and no encounters with Aes Sedai.
Chapter 13. Business in the City. They could have had food brought to their rooms, but after Moiraine healed Swan, they went down to the first sitting of dinner. Neither was willing to miss her first meal as Aes Sedai in the sisters' main dining hall, where accepted came only by rare invitation, and novices only to serve at table. It was a spacious high-ceilinged room, colorful winter tapestries decorating the white walls, broad cornice gleaming under a weight of gold leaf. The square tables, their slender legs elegantly carved, were only large enough for 4, and most spaced far apart for privacy of conversation, though today some were placed together to accommodate larger groups. The only women in the room wearing their shawls, they attracted looks from other sisters, not to mention a few amused smiles. Moiraine felt her cheeks heating, but it would take more than smiles to make her give up wearing the shawl every time she left her rooms. More than outright laughter. She had worked too hard to earn it. Swan marched across the bright floor tiles, patterns of all the Aja colors with a queenly grace, casually adjusting her shawl along her arms as though to draw attention to it. Swan was seldom shy. There were no benches here, but low-backed chairs carved to match the table legs, and where in their own dining hall accepted ate whatever the kitchen prepared, a young serving woman with the flame of Tarvalin on her breast curtsied before reciting what the kitchens here had to offer in the sing-song voice of one who made the same recitation often. Where accepted ate on heavy glazed pottery and had to serve and clear away their own plates, the same serving woman brought their food on a ropework silver tray, in dishes of thin white Tarabonner porcelain, impressed with the flame of Tarvalin all around the rim. Tarabon's work could not compare with what came from the islands of the Atha'amier, but it was hardly inexpensive. Swan complained that her fish was too heavily seasoned, yet she left nothing except the bones, and looked around as though thinking of asking for another. Moiraine had a rich soup of vegetables and beef, but she found she had little appetite, and in the end ate only a small piece of dark bread and drank a single cup of tea. She had to escape, but there was no escape. Just walking away from a task assigned by the Amerlin's seat was unthinkable. Maybe the Hall would decide the plan was untenable. No one had approached her concerning the matter since Tsutama had asked whether she had thought of being Queen of Cairhien. They might decide so. It seemed a thin hope, but thin hopes were all she could find. As soon as they returned to the Blue Quarters, Edith summoned them to her rooms again and without ceremony handed each a letter of rights in the amount of 1,000 crowns gold. "You will receive the same from the tower each year on this day," she said. "Or if you are not here, it will be deposited as you specify." The distaste of her earlier lecture had departed entirely. She wore a serene smile, serene and pleased at having gained 2 new blues. "Spend wisely. You can obtain more if need be, but ask too often and you will have to answer questions in the hall. Believe me, being questioned in the hall is never pleasant. Never." Swan's eyes grew very round reading the amount, and impossible as it seemed, wider still at mention of getting more. Few merchants cleared more gold in a year, and many minor nobles made do with far less. But the tower could not afford to have sisters seen in poverty. The Sun Palace had taught Moiraine that power often grew from others deciding that you already had power, and an appearance of wealth could give that. She had her own banker, but Swan deposited her letter of rights with the tower, in spite of an offered introduction. Swan's father had not earned 1,000 crowns over his entire life, and she was not about to put that sum at any risk whatsoever. Nothing Moiraine said could convince her. Safety alone concerned her, and it seemed a banking house old enough to have loaned gold to Arthur Hawkwing could not be challenged in that regard by the first bank founded after the breaking. Wearing her blue-fringed shawl displayed proudly on her shoulders, Moiraine hired a sedan chair in the great square in front of the tower, where the milling mid-afternoon crowd of strollers and hawkers, tumblers and jugglers, musicians and barrowmen selling meat pies and roasted nuts, all kept their distance from the huge structure. Few people went nearer than 100 paces unless they had business with the tower or wanted to present a petition. The two bearers, husky fellows in dark brown coats with their long hair neatly tied back, carried her smoothly through the streets, the lead man crying, "Make way for an Aes Sedai! Make way for an Aes Sedai!" The shouting seemed to impress no one, and perhaps was not believed. Even with the heavy curtains tied back, the fringe on her shawl would remain hidden unless she propped her arms inelegantly on the windowsills. No one moved aside any faster than they did for wagon drivers' shouts, and often more slowly, since the wagon drivers carried long whips and were not reluctant to use them. Even so, soon enough they reached what appeared to be a small palace on a broad boulevard with tall leafless trees marching down the center strip, and unfastened the poles so she could open the door. The building was in a southern style with a high white dome and narrow spires at the four corners, and broad marble stairs climbing to a wide, white-columned portico. Yet there was a restraint about it. The stone carvings, friezes of vines and leaves, were well done, yet simple and not overly plentiful. No one would leave money with a banking house that was poor, but neither would anyone with a bank that spent too lavishly on itself. A doorman with two bands of red on his dark coat sleeves bowed her through the tall front doors and handed her over to a plain-coated footman, a pretty young man, if too tall, who gravely guided her to the study of Mistress Dormila, a slim, graying little woman a full hand shorter than Moiraine. Her father had banked with Elaine Dormila's elder brother, who still handled her own accounts in Cairhien, making her choice easy in Tar Valon. A slight smile broke Mistress Dormila's usual solemn expression when she saw the shawl, and she spread her dark, red-banded skirts in a precise curtsy, neither too brief nor too deep. But then she had given the same courtesy even when Moiraine had come in an acceptance dress. After all, she knew how much Moiraine had left with the bank on her first arrival in the city, and how much more her estates had sent over the years. Still, the smile was genuine. "May I offer congratulations, Moiraine Sedai?" she said warmly, escorting Moiraine to a cushioned chair with a high, carved back. "Will you have spiced wine or tea? Perhaps some honeyed cakes or poppy seed?" "The wine, thank you," Moiraine replied with a smile. "That will suffice." Moiraine Sedai. This was the first time anyone had called her that, and she rather liked the sound. Once the other woman had issued orders to the footman, she took a chair facing Moiraine without asking. You did not require your banker to stand too far on ceremony. "I assume you have come to deposit your stipend." Of course a banker would know of that. "If you seek further information, I fear I put everything I knew into the letter I sent to you, and I have learned nothing more." For an instant, Moiraine's smile froze in place. With an effort, she unfroze it, made her voice casual. "Suppose you tell it to me again. I may winnow out something, hearing it fresh." Mistress Dormila inclined her head slightly. "As you say, 9 days ago a man came to me, a Cairhienan, wearing the uniform of a captain in the Tower Guard and giving the name Rhys Gorthanus. He spoke with cultured accents, an educated man, perhaps even nobility, and he was tall, a good 3 hands or more taller than me, and broad-shouldered with a soldier's bearing. He was clean-shaven, of course, and his face was well-proportioned and good-looking, despite a scar about 1 inch long here." With one finger, she drew a line from the corner of her left eye back toward her ear. Neither name nor description jogged anything in Moiraine's memory, not that she would have spoken if they had. She made a small gesture for the banker to go on. "He presented an order purportedly signed and sealed by the Amerlin seat directing me to lay open your finances to him. Unfortunately for him, I know Tomro Spenya's signature well, and the White Tower knows I would never reveal the affairs of my patrons in any respect. I had several footmen overpower him and lock him in an empty strong room, and then I sent for real Tower guards. I regret failing to take the opportunity to thrash his mistress or master's name out of him, but as you know, White Tower law takes a dim view of that." The footman returned with an ornate silver pitcher and 2 silver goblets on a tray, and the banker fell silent until he had gone. "He escaped before the guards arrived," she went on. pouring dark wine that gave off the sweet scent of spices. A matter of bribery. A grimace of distaste twisted her mouth for a moment as she offered Moiraine a goblet with a small bow. I had the young man involved strapped, so I wager he still feels it when he sits down. I then hired him out as a bilge boy on a river ship running ice peppers to Tyr, where he will be put ashore penniless, unless he persuades the captain to keep him on. I made sure of that by convincing her to give me his wages in advance. He is a pretty youth. He might persuade her. I think she had it in mind when she handed over the coins. Directing a level look at the other woman across her goblet, Moiraine raised a quizzical eyebrow. She was quite proud of her outer coolness, as great as anything she had displayed while being tested. The false guard captain broke tower law, Moiraine Sedai, Mistress Dormila blandly answered the unspoken question, and I was required to hand him over to the Justice of the Tower. But internal matters I prefer to keep internal. I tell you only because you were involved. You understand? Moiraine nodded. Of course. No bank could afford to have it known one of its employees took bribes. She suspected the young man had gotten off so lightly because he was someone's son or nephew, else he might well have floated downriver on his own. Bankers were hard folk. Mistress Dormila did not ask what Moiraine knew or thought of the matter. Such was no business of hers. Her face did not even show curiosity. This discretion was one reason Moiraine had never kept more than a little coin with the tower. As a novice, without access to the city, it had been unnecessary, but her own sense of privacy made her continue the practice as accepted. Tower law required equal representation of every Ajah in the tower's bank, and now that she wore the shawl, she did not want her affairs known to other Blues, much less other Ajahs, especially after what she had just been told. The only reason the tower would have held back Mistress Dormila's letter was that the Hall hoped to lull her into thinking they had decided against putting her on the Sun Throne. But they had made their first moves, or rather, since they would have been as careful as thieves trying to cut a well-guarded lady's purse, many more than the first. Enough for someone to puzzle out their intention. Nothing else explained a Kyrianan trying to find out how she was dispersing money and to whom. Oh, Light. They were going to do it before she knew what was happening, unless she found a way out. She let nothing show on her face, of course, merely sipping her wine, letting the warm sweetness slide down her throat, all outward serenity. You have done very well by me, Mistress Dormila, to the pain of your house. Please transfer a suitable recompense from my accounts to your own. Very properly, the banker demurred twice, bowing her head, before accepting with a show of reluctance that Moiraine barely noticed. Light, she had to find a way out. She began laying plans, not to run away, but to be ready. She signed over her letter of rights, and before leaving, gave instructions at which Mistress Dormila displayed no hint of surprise. Perhaps that was because she also was Kyrianan and so accustomed to Desdemar. Or maybe bankers were all stoic. Perhaps she had other Aes Sedai as patrons. If so, Moiraine would learn of it only if the sisters told her. The grave was less discreet than Elaine Dormila. Back in the tower, she asked around until she settled on the name of a seamstress. No fewer than 5 Blues named Tamura Alcohima as the best in Tarvalon, and even those who spoke other names allowed that Tamura was very good. So the following afternoon, she and Swan took sedan chairs to Mistress Alcohima's shop, with Swan grumbling about the fare. Really, it was only a silver penny. It had taken considerable effort to induce Swan to go with her. How could the woman think 4 dresses sufficient? She was going to have to learn not to be parsimonious. Mistress Alcohima's establishment, its walls lined with tall shelves bearing stacked bolts of silk and fine wool in every hue imaginable, was one of a number of large shops that occupied the ground floor of a building that seemed to be all curves. It suited Tamura very well. Fair-skinned for a Damani, she would have made Gitara seem almost boyish in comparison. When she came to greet them, their fringed shawls assured a personal greeting, Rather than simply walking, she seemed to flow gracefully between the smaller shelves full of laces and ribbons and the dressmakers' forms clothed in half-finished garments. Her half-dozen assistants all curtsied deeply, young pretty women garbed in finely sewn examples of their native land's styles, each different. But there were no curtsies from the seamstress. She knew her place in this world. Her pale green dress, elegant and simple at the same time, spoke well of her talents, though it did cling in an alarming manner, molding her in a way that left no doubts of exactly what lay beneath the silk. Tamora's languorous smile widened at hearing their order, and well it should have. Few of her patrons would come for an entire wardrobe in one visit. At least, it widened for Moiraine. Under prodding, Swan had agreed on 6 dresses to make up one for each day of the week with what she already had, but she wanted them in wool. Moiraine ordered 20, half with skirts divided for riding, all in the best silk. She could have done with fewer, but the hall might check. An order for 20 would make them think her settled in Tarvalon. She and Swan quickly found themselves in a back room where Tamora watched as 4 of her assistants undressed them to the skin and measured them, turning them this way and that for the seamstress to see what she had to work with. Under almost any other circumstances, this would have embarrassed Moiraine near to death. But this was for a seamstress, and that made all the difference. Then it was time for the fabric to come out for choices. Tamora knew what the fringe on their shawls meant, and shades of blue predominated. "I want decent dresses, mind," Swan said. "High necks, and nothing too snug." That with a pointed look at Tamora's garment. Moiraine nearly groaned. Light Send Swan did not mean to go all this way. "I think perhaps this is too light for me," Moiraine murmured, as a tall yellow-haired girl in green with a square-cut neckline that displayed too much cleavage draped sky-blue silk over her. "I was thinking of Kyrianan styles, without house colors or embroidery," she suggested. She could never wear Domodred colors inside the tower. "A Kyrianan cut, of course," Tamora said, thumbing her full lower lip thoughtfully. "That will suit you very well. But that hue is lovely against your pale skin. Half of your dresses must be of light color, and half embroidered. You require elegance, not plainness. Perhaps only a quarter in each?" A Kyrianan cut suited her very well? Was the woman implying she could not succeed in wearing a Damani dress? Not that she would. Tamora's garment was indecent, but there was the principle of the thing. The seamstress shook her head. "At least a third in light colors," she said firmly. "At least. And half embroidered." Frowning slightly, she rubbed her thumb across her underlip again. "A third and half," Moiraine agreed, before the woman could go higher, as she seemed to be considering. With a good seamstress, it was always a matter of negotiation. She could live with a little embroidery. "Do you have anything cheaper, Mistress Alcohima?" Swan demanded, frowning down at the fine blue wool draped on her. Light! She had been asking prices. No wonder the girls with her looked scandalized. "Will you excuse me just a brief moment, Tamora?" Moiraine said, and when the seamstress nodded, she handed the length of silk to the Andoran girl and hurriedly took Swan aside. "Listen to me, Swan, and do not argue," she whispered in a rush. "We must not keep Tamora waiting long. Do not ask after prices. She will tell us the cost after we make our selections. Nothing you buy here will be cheap, but the dresses Tamora sews for you will make you look Aes Sedai as much as the shawl does. And it is Tamora, not Mistress Alcohima. You must observe the proprieties, or she will believe you are mocking her. But try thinking of her as a sister who stands just a little above you. A touch of deference is necessary, just a touch, but she will tell you what to wear as much as she asks." Swan scowled over her shoulder at the Damani woman. Light! She scowled! "And will the bloody shoemaker tell us what kind of slippers to buy and charge us enough to buy 50 new sets of nets?" "No!" Moiraine said impatiently. Tamora was only arching one eyebrow, yet her face might as well have been like a thunderhead. The meaning of that eyebrow was clear as the finest crystal. They had already made the seamstress wait too long, and there would be a price for it. And that scowl. She hurried on, whispering as fast as she could. The shoemaker will make what we want, and we will bargain the price with him, but not too hard if we want his best work. The same with the glove maker, the stocking maker, the shift maker, and all the rest. Just be glad neither of us needs a hairdresser. The best hairdressers are true tyrants, nearly as bad as perfumers. Swan barked a laugh as if she were joking, but she would learn if she ever sat for a hairdresser, not knowing how her hair was to be arranged, until the hairdresser was finished and allowed her to look in a mirror. At least that was how it was in Kyrian. Once the choices of colors had been agreed upon and the forms of embroidery, negotiation was necessary even there, as well as on which dresses were to be embroidered. They still had to stay for the first dress to be cut and pinned on them, a task Tamora deftly performed herself with a pincushion fastened to her wrist. Moiraine quickly learned what the price would be for making the woman wait. The fabric she pinned for Moiraine was a blue even paler than the sky blue, almost a blue tinged white, and the way she pinned Swan's dark blue wool, it was going to be nearly as snug at bosom and hips as her own garment. It could have been worse. The seamstress could have accidentally stuck them a dozen times and demanded a pinning for every dress. But Moiraine was sure her first dresses would all be the lightest shades. The prices Tamora mentioned once the pinned garments had been slipped off them and onto dressmakers' forms made Swan's eyes pop, though at least she remained silent. She would learn. In a city like Tarvalin, 1 gold crown for a woolen dress and 10 for a silk were reasonable from a seamstress of Tamora's quality. Still, Moiraine murmured that she would give a generous gratuity for speedy completion. Otherwise, they might not see anything for months. Before leaving, she told Tamora that she had decided on 5 more riding dresses in the strictest Kyrianan style, which was to say dark, though she did not put it that way, each with 6 slashes across the breast in red, green, and white, far fewer than she had a right to. The Damani woman's expression did not alter at this evidence that she was a rather minor member of a noble house. Sewing for Aes Sedai would count with sewing for the high seat of a house, or perhaps even a ruler. I would like them made last, if you please, Moiraine told her, and do not send them. Someone will pick them up. I can promise you they will be last, Aes Sedai. Oh yes, her first dresses were going to be pale, but the second part of her plan was accomplished. For the moment she was as ready as she could be. Chapter 14. Changes. The sisters who had said there was almost as much to learn after gaining the shawl as before were proven right in short order. Moiraine and Swan had learned the complexities of White Tower customs as accepted, especially which ones had been in existence so long they had the force of law and the penalties for violating them. Now Raphella and others spent hours instructing them in the long list of Blue Aja customs, accreted over 3,000 years. Swan actually retained most of what Raphella had told them during their first walk to the Blue Quarters, and Moiraine had to work hard to catch up. It would have been a shame to gain a penance for something so trivial as wearing red inside the tower. Red gems were allowed, fire drops or rubies or garnets, but the color was forbidden in clothing, a matter of some long-standing animosity between the blue and the red, so old no one was actually certain what had begun it or when. Blue and red opposed each other as a matter of course, at times bringing the hall to a near standstill. The very idea of enmity between Ajas startled her, yet there were other oppositions. While the green and the blue had seen few breaks in their accord for several centuries, the situation was far different regarding other Ajas. At the moment, there was a slight strain with the white, for reasons known only to the white, and something more tense with the yellow, with sisters of each accusing sisters of the other of interfering with their actions in Altara some 100 years past. Strong custom forbade interference with another sister, a custom that provided the sole release from the customary deference, outside the tower at least. And then there were the permutations. For example, the brown supported the white against the blue, but supported the blue against the yellow. For the time being, anyway. These things could last for centuries, or shift in the blink of an eye. It also was necessary to learn what antagonisms and rivalries existed between other Ajahs, too, where they were known. Each was a snare lying in wait for an unwary step or a careless word. Light, the tangle of it all made Desdemar child's play. Swan heard her recitations every night, just as they had as novice and accepted, and she heard Swan's. Though there hardly seemed a point, Swan never made any mistakes. They found themselves studying the power again, with Lelaine and Natassia and Anaya and others taking turns, learning the warder bond and other weaves not trusted to accepted, including a few known only to the Blue. Moiraine found that very interesting. If the Blue included weaves among their Ajah secrets, surely the other Ajahs did as well. And if the Ajahs, perhaps individual sisters. After all, she had had one, her first learned, before coming to Tar Valon, and had carefully concealed it from the sisters. They had been aware the spark was already ignited in her, but she told them only about lighting candles and making a ball of light to find her way in the dark. No one lived in the Sun Palace without learning to keep secrets. Did Swan have any secret weaves? It was not the sort of question you could ask your closest friend. Although they knew enough now of Saidar to learn quickly, there simply was too much for a day or a week. At least, Moiraine could not do it. The method of ignoring heat or cold turned out to be a trick of mental concentration, simple enough once you knew how, or so Natassia pronounced. The mind must be as still as an unruffled pond throughout, she said pedantically, just as she lectured in the classroom. They were in her rooms, where almost every flat surface was covered with figurines and small carvings and painted miniatures. These lessons always took place in the teachers' rooms. Focusing on a point behind your navel in the center of your body, you begin to breathe at an unvarying pace, but not as normally. Each inhalation must take exactly the same length of time, and each exhalation, and between, for that same space, you do not breathe. In time, that will come quite naturally. Breathing so, focused so, soon your mind becomes detached from the outer world, no longer acknowledging heat or cold. You might walk naked in a blizzard or across a desert without shivering or sweating. Taking a sip of tea, Natassia laughed, her dark, tilted eyes twinkling. Frostbite and sunburn would still present difficulties after a time. Only the mind is truly distanced, the body much less so. Simple, perhaps, yet for above a week, Moiraine's focus might slip at any time, sitting at supper or walking down a corridor, and she would let out a gasp as the cold suddenly rushed in and bit down 3 times as hard as before she began the meditation. In public, all that huffing attracted stares from other sisters. She very much feared she was gaining a reputation as a dreamer, and as a constant blusher. It was hardly to be borne. Needless to say, Swan picked up the trick straight away and never shivered again that Moiraine saw. The Feast of Lights came to mark the turning of the year, and for 2 days every window in Tar Valon shone brightly from twilight till dawn. In the tower, servants entered chambers that had been unused for centuries to light lamps and make sure they burned the whole 2 days. It was a joyous celebration, with processions of citizens carrying lamps through the night-cloaked streets, and merry gatherings that frequently lasted until sunrise in even the poorest homes. But it filled Moiraine with sadness. Chambers unused for centuries. The White Tower was dwindling, and she could not see what was to be done about it. But then, if women who had worn the shawl 200 years or more could find no solution, why should she be able to? Many sisters received ornately inscribed invitations to balls during the feast, and quite a number accepted. Aes Sedai could like dancing as well as any other woman. Moiraine got invitations too, from Cairienin nobles of 24 houses, and almost as many merchants wealthy enough to rub shoulders with the nobility. Only the Hall's plans for her could have placed so many powerful Cairienin in the city at one time. She tossed the stiff white cards into the fireplace unanswered. A dangerous move in Desdemar, with no way to tell how it might be interpreted, but she was not playing the game of houses. She was hiding. Surprisingly, their first dresses were delivered early on the first day of the feast. Either Tamora was eager for her gratuity, or more likely, she thought they would want the garments for feast day festivities. She came with 2 of her assistants to see whether any adjustments were necessary, but none were. Tamora was excellent at what she did. Moiraine had been right, though. The darkest of her 6 was in a hue little deeper than sky blue, and only 2 were embroidered, which meant nearly everything else would be. She would have to keep on wearing the woolens the Aja had given her a while longer. At least all of her riding dresses would be dark. Even Tamora could not ask for a riding dress in too light a hue. Swan's dresses, only one divided for riding, displayed all the elegance Tamora was capable of, making them suitable for a palace despite being wool, but they emphasized her bosom and hips quite strongly. Swan affected not to notice, or perhaps did not. She really cared very little about clothing. Some things were not easy for Swan either. She returned from Satalia's apartments with a face that grew stiffer by the day. Every day she became more prickly and irritable, but she refused to reveal what the problem was, and even snapped at Moiraine when she persisted in asking. That was worrying. She could count on the fingers of one hand, with fingers left over, the times Swan had gotten angry with her in 6 years. The day Tamora delivered the dresses, however, Swan joined her for tea in her rooms before going down to supper. But instead of taking a cup, she flung herself down in a leaf-carved armchair and folded her arms angrily beneath her breasts. Her face was anything but stiff, and her eyes were blue fire. "That bloody fangfish of a woman will be the bloody death of me yet," she growled. That half a week had undone every scrap of the sister's hard work with her language. Fish guts! She expects me to jump like a spawning redtail. I never jumped so fast when I was a... She gave a strangled grunt, and her eyes popped as the first oath clamped down. Coughing, her face turning pale, she pounded a fist on her chest. Moiraine hastily poured a cup of tea, but it was minutes before Swan could drink. Her mind must have been racing for her to come that close. "Well, not when I was accepted, anyway," she muttered once she could speak again. "From the moment I arrive, it's, 'Find this Swan and do that Swan, and aren't you finished yet, Swan?' Satalia snaps her fingers and bloody well expects me to jump." "That is how things are," Moiraine said judiciously. The situation could have been much worse, but Swan's mind apparently had changed on that point, and she did not want to start an argument. "It will not last forever, and only a handful of sisters stand so high above us." "That's easy for you to say," Swan grumbled. "You don't have bloody Satalia snapping her fingers at you." That was true, yet it hardly meant her task was easy. The new lessons left her little free time, but she had hoped distributing the bounty would allow her to search among the camps that still remained. Instead, for 2 or 3 hours each morning, she sat in a windowless room on the 8th level of the tower, just large enough for a plain writing table and 2 straight-backed chairs. Mirrored stand lamps of unadorned brass stood in the 4 corners, giving a good and very necessary light. Lacking them, the chamber would have been twilight dark at noon. Normally a senior clerk sat there, but whoever that was, she or he had left no imprint on the room at all. Only inkwell, pen tray, sand jar, and a small white bowl of alcohol for cleaning the pens sat on the table, and the pale stone walls were bare. The considerably larger outer room was crowded by rows of high, narrow writing desks and tall stools, but as soon as she arrived, the clerks formed a line that stretched from her writing table and nearly circled their own room, bringing her lists of women who had received the bounty and reports on arrangements to send the money to women who had already left. The number of those reports was distressing. Few camps remained, and the last were melting away like frost in sunlight. None of the clerks used her second chair, only stood respectfully while she read each page and signed her approval at the bottom, then curtsied or bowed and made way for the next without a word. Very quickly, she began to think it really might be possible to die of boredom. She tried to make them arrange the distribution faster. The tower's vast resources could have seen to it in a week, surely. The tower held hundreds more clerks, but clerks worked at their own pace. They even seemed to slow down after her suggestion of speed. She considered begging Tamra to release her from the task, but why put herself to useless effort? What better way to keep her shackled in Tar Valon until the Hall's schemes came to fruition? Boredom and frustration. Still, she had her plan. That helped, a bit. Slowly, a conviction settled in her. If worst came to worst, she would run, whatever penance that earned her. Any penance lay in the future, and must end eventually. The Sun Throne would be a sentence for life. The day after the Feast of Lights, Elid was summoned to her testing, though Moiraine only heard of it after. The beautiful accepted who wanted to become a green failed to come out of the ter'angreal. There was no announcement. The White Tower never flaunted its failures, and a woman dying in her test was counted a great failure on the tower's part. Elid simply disappeared, and her belongings were taken away. There was a day of mourning, however, and Moiraine wore white ribbons in her hair and tied a long lace-edged white silk kerchief around each arm so they dangled to her wrists. She had never liked Elid, but the woman deserved her grief. Not every sister who was strong enough to make them jump showed any desire to do so. Elida avoided them, or at least they did not see her again before hearing she had left to return to Andor. Even so, learning she was gone was a relief. She stood as high as they would one day, and could have made their lives a misery almost as badly as she had when they were novice and accepted. Perhaps worse. The petty errands novice and accepted took as expected would have been near a penance for them as Aes Sedai. Perhaps more than near. Lilane, who stood as high as Elida and was a sitter to boot, had them to tea several times to ease the strain of the first weeks, as she put it. Swan got on very well with her, though she made Moiraine a little nervous with that penetrating gaze. It always seemed that Lilane knew more of you than she revealed, that you had no secrets with her. But then Swan appeared unable to understand Moiraine's liking for Anaya. It was not the healing. Anaya was warm and open, and made you feel that all would come out well in the end. Almost any conversation with Anaya turned out comforting. Moiraine thought that in time she might become as close a friend as Lyanna, if not so close as Swan. That friendship with Lyanna took up right where it had left off, for her and Swan both, and brought with it Adina Canford, a plump, blue-eyed woman with short-cut black hair who displayed not a hint of arrogance, despite being Andoran. Of course, she was not very strong in the power. It really was becoming second nature to consider that. They renewed acquaintance with sisters of other Ajahs who had been accepted with them, and found that in some cases friendship revived within a few words, and in others had shrunk to mere amity, while a few had grown too accustomed to the gap between Aes Sedai and accepted to close it again, now they wore the shawl too. It was enough. Friends lightened many burdens, even those they did not know of. Friends or no friends, though, the days passed with glacial slowness. Malin finally departed the tower, and then Kareen, followed in turn by Aisha, Ludis, and Valera. But Moiraine's relief that the search was underway at last was tempered by frustration at being kept out of it. Swan began to grow interested in her job, to the point where her complaints started to seem more for the form of the thing. She headed off to Satalia's rooms earlier than need be, and often remained until the second or third sitting of supper. Moiraine had no such buffer. Her nightmares continued, of the babe in the snow and the faceless man and the sun throne, although not as frequently, save the last. Ever as bad, though. She banished most of the lace and ruffles from her rooms, which required only a visit to a cushion maker and a small wait for their alteration by 2s and 3s. Not all, because of Anaya's obvious if silent disappointment at seeing them go, so her bed remained an ocean of froth that made Swan giggle with delight. but she spent more time in her other rooms, so the bed it had to be. After numerous efforts, she managed to bake a pie without burning it black, but Ealdra took one bite and turned pale green. Swan produced a fish pie that the gray-haired sister declared quite tasty. Only within the hour she was running for the privy and required healing. No one accused them of doing anything deliberate, which they had not, but Anaya and Chiron thought it an excellent repayment for greediness. Only a week after Elid on High Chasseline, Shiriam was tested and passed. Technically, Swan was the newest blue by a hair, but Satalia refused to lose her services for even a few hours, so it was Moiraine who laid the shawl on the fire-haired Saldaean's shoulders when she chose the blue the following day, and escorted her beaming back to the blue quarters for the welcome, where Swan managed to nip in for the 6th kiss. Shiriam was a very good cook, and loved to bake. It was the day of reflection in Cairhien, yet Moiraine could not manage to dwell on her sins and faults. She and Swan had regained a friend they had feared might be lost for a year. Swan even suggested bringing Shiriam into their search, and talking her out of it required hours. It was not that Moiraine feared Shiriam would expose them to Tamra, but Shiriam had been one of the biggest gossips in the Accepted's quarters. She never told what she promised to keep hidden, yet she would be unable to resist giving hints of such a juicy secret, hints that she had a secret, as Swan should have known very well. Let others know you possessed a secret, and some would work to learn it. That was a fact of nature. Sometimes Swan did not know the meaning of caution. Sometimes? No, never. Sisters began to talk of a resurgence in the tower with so many passing for the shawl in so short a time, and perhaps another 1 or 2 who might very soon. By custom, none spoke of Elid, but Moiraine thought of her. 1 woman dead and 3 raised to the shawl in the space of 2 weeks, but the only novice to test for Accepted in that time had failed and been sent away, and not 1 name was added to the novice book, while above 20 novices too weak ever to reach the shawl were put out. Those chambers would remain unused for centuries more at this rate, until they were all unused. Swan tried to soothe her, but how could she be happy when the White Tower was destined to become a monument to the dead? 3 days later, Moiraine wished she had spent the day of reflection properly. She was not superstitious, but failure to do so always brought ill luck to someone you cared for, so it was said. She was at the 2nd sitting of breakfast, slowly eating her porridge and fretting over the boredom of torture by clerk to come, when Rima Galfrey glided into the dining room. Slim and elegant in yellow-slashed green, much of a height with Moiraine, she was not one of those Moiraine needed to defer to, but she had a regal bearing, accentuated by the rubies in her hair like a crown, and a haughty cast typical of yellows to her face. Startlingly, she wove air and fire to make her voice clearly audible in every corner of the dining hall. Last night, Tamra Ospenya, the Watcher of the Seals, the Flame of Tarvalon, the Armelin Seed, died in her sleep. May the light shine on her soul. Her voice was perfectly self-possessed, as though she had announced it would rain that day, and she waited only long enough to run a cool eye over the room to make sure her words had been absorbed before leaving. A buzz of talk started up immediately at the other tables, but Moiraine sat stunned. Aes Sedai died before their time as often as anyone else, and sisters did not grow feeble with the years. Death came in apparent full good health, yet this was so unexpected that she felt hit on the head by a hammer. The light illumined Tamra's soul, she prayed silently. The light illumine her soul, surely it would. What would happen to the search for the boy-child now? Nothing, of course. Tamra's chosen searchers knew their task. They would inform the new Armelin of their task. Perhaps the new Armelin would release her from her own labor, if she got to the woman before the hall informed her of their scheme. Self-disgust immediately stabbed her heart, and she pushed the bowl of porridge away, all appetite gone. A woman she admired with all her soul had died, and she thought of advantage in it. Desdemar truly was ingrained in her bones. and maybe all the darkness of the Damodreds. She very nearly asked Marian for a penance, but the Mistress of Novices might give her something that would hold her in Tar Valon longer. Considering that just added to her guilt. So she set her own penance. Only one dress she owned came close to the white of grieving, the blue so pale it seemed more white tinged with blue, and she put that on for Tamra's funeral rites. Tamora had embroidered the garment front and back and sleeves with a fine, intricate blue mesh that looked innocent enough until she actually donned the dress. Then it seemed as blatant as what the seamstress herself had worn. No, not seemed, it was. She very nearly wept after examining herself in the stand mirror. Swan blinked at the sight of her in the corridor outside their rooms. "Are you sure you want to wear that?" She sounded half-strangled. Long white ribbons were tied in her hair, and longer tied around her arms. The passing sisters all wore variations of the same. Aes Sedai never put on full mourning except for whites, who did not consider it so. "Sometimes a penance is required," Moiraine replied, deliberately moving her shawl down into the crooks of her elbows, and Swan asked no more. There were questions one asked, and questions one did not. That was strong custom, and friendship. Wearing their shawls, every sister residing in the tower gathered at a secluded clearing in a woody part of the tower grounds, where Tamra's body lay on a bier, sewn into a simple blue shroud. The morning air was more than brisk. Moiraine was aware of that, despite feeling no urge to shiver, and even the surrounding oaks were still leafless beneath a gray sky, their thick twisted limbs suitable framing for a funeral. Moiraine's garment earned more than a few raised eyebrows, but the sister's disapproval was part of her penance. Mortification of the spirit was always the hardest to endure. Strangely, the whites all wore glossy black ribbons, yet it must have been an Aja custom, for it garnered no frowns or stares from the other sisters. They must have seen it before. Any who wished were allowed to speak a prayer or a few words in memory, and most did. Only the sitters spoke among the Reds, and then in very few words, but perhaps that was custom as well. Moiraine made herself go forward and stand before the bier, shawl loosely draped, exposing herself, knowing she would be the focus of every eye, the hardest to bear. May the light illumine Tamra's soul brightly as she deserved, and may she shelter in the Creator's hand until her rebirth. The light send her a radiant rebirth. I cannot think of any woman I admired more than Tamra. I admire her and honor her still. I always will. Tears welled in her eyes, and not from the humiliation that stabbed her like long thorns. She had never really known Tamra. Novices and accepted never really knew sisters, much less the Amyrlin seat. But oh, light, she would miss her. According to Tamra's wishes, her body was consumed by flows of fire, and her ashes scattered across the grounds of the White Tower by the sisters of the Aja she had been raised from, the Aja to which she had returned in death. Moiraine was not alone in weeping. Aes Sedai's serenity could not armor against all things. The rest of the day she wore that shaming dress, and that night burned it. She would never have been able to look at it again without remembering. Until a new Amyrlin was raised, the Hall of the Tower reigned over the tower, but there were increasingly strict measures in the law to ensure they did not dally too long, and by the evening after Tamra's funeral, Sierin Vayu had been raised from the grey. An Amyrlin was supposed to grant indulgences and relief from penances on the day she assumed the stole and the staff. None came from Sierin, and in the space of half a week, every last male clerk in the tower had been dismissed without a character, supposedly for flirting with novices or accepted, or for inappropriate looks and glances, which could have meant anything. Even men so old their grandchildren had children went, and some who had no liking for women at all. No one commented on it, however. No one dared, not where it might come to Sierin's ears. 3 sisters were exiled from Tar Valon for a year, and twice Moiraine was forced to join the others in the Traitor's Court, to watch an Aes Sedai stripped and stretched tight on the triangle, then birched till she howled. A ward that formed a shimmering gray dome over the stone-paved court held in the shrieks till they seemed to crowd in on Moiraine, stifling thought, stifling breath. For the first time in a week she lost focus and shivered in the cold. And not only from the cold. She feared those screams would ring in her ears for a very long time, waking or sleeping. Ciaran watched and listened with utter calm. A new Amyrlin chose her own keeper, of course, and could order a new mistress of novices if she wished. Ciaran had done both. Oddly, Amira, the stocky woman whose long beaded braids flailed as she worked the birch with a will, was a red, and so was the new keeper, Duhara. Neither law nor custom demanded that either keeper or mistress of novices be of the Amyrlin's former Aja, yet it was expected. But then, whispers told of considerable surprise when Ciaran had chosen the grey over the red. Moiraine did not think any of Tomra's searchers would tell Ciaran of the hunt for the boy-child. On the day after the second birching, she presented herself in the anteroom to the Amyrlin's study, where Duhara sat rigidly upright behind her writing table with a red stole a hand wide draped around her neck. Her dark dress was so slashed with scarlet it might as well have been all scarlet. A Damani, Duhara was slim and beautiful despite being near a hand and a half taller than she, but the woman's full lips had a meanness about them, and her eyes searched for fault. Moiraine reminded herself that without the keeper's stole, Duhara would have had to jump when she snapped her fingers, should she have chosen to. As she opened her mouth, the door to the Amyrlin's study banged open, and Ciaran strode out with a paper in her hand. "Duhara, I need you to— Now what do you want?" That last was barked at Moiraine, who curtsied promptly, and as deeply as she had as a novice, kissing the great serpent ring on the Amyrlin's right hand before rising. That ring was Ciaran's only display of jewelry. Her 7-striped stole was half the width of Duhara's stole, and her dark grey silks were simply cut. Quite plump, her round face appeared to have been constructed for jolliness, but she wore implacable grimness as though it had been carved there. Moiraine could almost look her straight in the eyes. Hard eyes. Her mouth felt dry, and she fought not to shiver in a cold that suddenly seemed worse than the heart of winter, but quick calming exercises failed to produce